Hello friends, this is Keith from the Solo Gamers Club. Tonight I'm going to walk the viewers through the procedures that I use to paint models for board games. This video is not intended for advanced painters. It's intended to assist those with little or no experience in painting. I'm not an expert, so these tips will only show how I approach the task of painting. This procedure will produce decent results, but they won't be displayed in any museums, that's for sure. I recently received an order from Mr. B Games that included the models for one of my favorite new games, Spring and Autumn, The Story of China. And I'll be using those models as the basis for this video. Much of the process of painting involves good planning. I always start out by examining the models that I'll be painting and determine if they need any prep work before I get started. With these models, I was surprised to find that the military models already have their bases molded in the 5 colors of the factions. Although they would likely look better painted, I'm seriously considering leaving them as is, as this would save a great deal of time priming and painting them. As for the buildings, they'll definitely need some painting. Although the exterior of each building clearly indicates which building it is, without a color reference, they will likely blend in with the other units on the board. I begin the process by photographing each type of model and then printing the photos out. I'll use them to plan the color schemes for each style of building. With the exception of the palace models, each group of models can be painted with the same color scheme, as the buildings are used generically, regardless of the faction where they're built. To get an idea of the colors that I'll use, I consult the excellent artwork that is included in the game, and some internet work looking for photos of historic buildings in China from the period. For the palaces, I'm leaning to a light gray primer, and then painting portions of the palaces in the color of its parent faction, red, yellow, blue, white, and purple. For the sections of the Great Wall, I'm going to prime them with light gray primer and paint them with stone gray. I'll finish them with a light wash of Nuln oil to bring out the stone patterns in the model. For the other buildings, I've decided to take the lead from the artist. Markets will have yellow roofs. Along that, I'm going to paint the trim in red, and we're going to leave everything else in primer gray. For the assorted bits that are on the ground here, we'll choose colors that would be appropriate, brown baskets or boxes, etc. For the academies, I'm going to have the roof shingles in light blue, and we'll also add the red trim on the 4 corners. We'll leave everything else in primer gray, and then the steps we'll probably paint in a darker shade of gray to show the stone steps. For the shrines, I'm going to paint the roof tiles in green, and we'll add in the red trim on the 4 corners. Everything else will be left in the primer gray, and the steps we'll put into like a darker shade of gray. And finally, for the barracks, we'll have red shingles, and everything else will be left in primer gray. I'll create stone gray in the middle for the courtyard. I start by checking each of the models that I'll be painting to see if any of them have any flaws due to the production process. This usually includes spurs of plastic that I'll use a hobby knife to trim off. In the case of these models, there's very little that needs to be trimmed. They were in excellent shape. Now, as a part of the production process, the manufacturers use a release agent to free the models from the molds. And sometimes this residue can interfere with the primer and paint properly adhering to the models. Once the models have been trimmed and prepared, I usually get a bowl of warm water and mix in a few drops of Dawn dishwashing liquid. Basically, I just dip each model into the water, get it wet, And then using a soft brush, you just kind of basically gently wash the exterior of the model that you're painting. And then you can have, if you want, you can have a separate bowl of clean water that you could rinse the model on. So basically that's all I'm doing. And then once that's done, I'll usually rinse those off and then let those air dry for quite a while. You want to make sure that they're completely dry. And then once we've cleaned the models, then we, like I said, let them air dry. And you got to make sure that all the water is off of them. They got to be completely dry before you get to the primer step. And next is the primer step. I've selected to use Army Painter, and I'm using that in this gray color. I would have preferred it to be a little bit lighter gray than what I've got, but this will be just fine. One thing you should note is the lighter the primer, the more your colors will pop. If you prime the models in white, you'll have extremely bright colors. And if you prime the models in black, it'll be much more diminished. So in this case, I've selected the gray. Now, as primer gives off a very distinct and unpleasant smell, I'll be applying the primer outside. To avoid handling each model during the process, I mount them on a cardboard box using double-sided tape. This keeps them secure while I'm applying the primer and allows me to rotate the models to ensure even coverage with the primer. So basically what I do then is I get some double-sided tape. I haven't applied it to this yet, but that's what I'll use, and I'll stick these to the double-sided tape. Then when I pick up the box, I can use the edge of the box to hold on to while I'm doing the priming. And that gives me the ability to turn the box and get even coverage on all the models. It's important to make sure you keep enough space in between them so that you can, the primer will be able to get in to the surfaces of each model. Now there's two very important tips in using primer. The first is to thoroughly shake the can prior to use. And I usually do this for about 2 minutes to ensure that the primer is completely mixed. It's a little noisy, but you want to do that for about 2 minutes and make sure that that primer is completely and thoroughly mixed. And then usually before I would apply the primer to the models, I'll give it a little bit of a squirt and make sure that I'm getting the proper amount of coverage coming out of the nozzle. The next tip is do not apply too much primer. It's much better to build up the primer using short bursts and applying a moving action. So as an example, if I was going to be priming that model, I'm going to be using just short bursts. And you're going to move the can across the model. You don't want to have too much primer built up on any model because that's going to diminish any of the characteristics of the model. Like in this case, the stone blocks. We don't want those to be washed out with too much primer. Then once the primer has completely dried, we can get started with the painting process. I'm going to use those photos that I took with my notes, and that will ensure that I'm going to have all the models painted the same for each type of model. I use water-soluble acrylic paints, most of which I purchased at Walmart, and that's this Apple Barrel brand. They're quite reasonably priced, and they work pretty good for me. Occasionally I'll have some other brands that I've purchased over the years, but for the most part, I've got quite a collection of these Apple Barrel acrylic paints, and I use the matte color usually. Glossy I don't care for too much. The matte is better for me. Now before I begin any painting on the model, usually what I'll do is I'll test out the colors that I'm proposing on the base of the model. And even though the bases aren't going to be primed, it's going to give you a pretty good idea of what the shade looks like on that model. So in the instance of this wall section, I would check that against the gray color that it's going to be primed in. If that is too dark, then I would probably paint them in a stone gray color. And I'd probably select something like this granite gray. That would be probably a pretty good look to the final product of those wall sections. But it's always a good idea to test that color on the base, something that won't be seen. You don't want to put too many layers of paint on the models if you don't have to. So it's always a good idea to try to check that color with the base of a model that won't be seen. And then once I've tested the models on the base, like I said, I would adjust the colors. In the event that this blue was too light, we would probably go with something maybe like that aqua for the academies or whichever building we're doing. And then prior to painting, I'll usually get a sheet of paper towel or newspaper, and I'll usually tape it to my bench so it's not sliding around. Now, as these are water-soluble paints, I'll also get a bowl of warm water, and I'll usually add like 1 or 2 drops of Dawn and mix it in. And I'll use that to clean the brushes during the painting process. And once again, as with the primer, it's very important to thoroughly mix the paint. Shaking it is not enough. You should have like a toothpick or the end of an old paintbrush to stir the paint and make sure that you reach the bottom of the container. You want to make sure that all of that pigment is absorbed into the solution. Once you've mixed it thoroughly, then you can close the bottle and vigorously shake it. We want the paint to be completely mixed. I'll start off by dispensing a bit of paint into my paint tray. And you don't need a whole lot. It's better to have to add it later than to put too much in. So I would just open the cork and dispense some paint into there. If the paint is too thick, you can dilute it with a drop or 2 of water and mix it in. Next, it's important to select the proper type of brush for the work that you're going to be doing. In the case of these wall sections, they're all going to be one color, so we can use a little bit larger brush. And basically what we do is you would want to dip it into the paint, but you don't want to put too much paint on the brush. It's better to have less than too much. And you definitely don't want the paint to ever get up to the ferrules. That's bad. It's very difficult to clean them that way. So basically what I would do then is dip in a little bit of paint, and then we're just going to paint it in the direction of the majority of the molding on it. So I would just paint that in like so and make sure we've got even coverage. Now in the case of, say, this palace, we're going to need to do a little bit more finer work, so I would select a finer tipped brush. And then what I would be doing is taking some of the paint up and then just trying to be careful. We're going to be leaving the gray on these models on the interior part, so we don't want to interfere with that. We're just basically going to be painting these roof sections. And I would make sure that I would carefully do that with the color scheme of whatever model this is going to be for yellow, the blue, or white, etc. Now, if your coverage isn't good enough, if there's, say, some bleeding through of the primer and you want it to be a little darker, wait till the model's completely dry and then just do a second coat. It's better to build up the paint than try to put too much paint on at one time. It takes longer for them to dry and it just doesn't look as nice. You're better off putting it in layers in multiple paintings rather than trying to get too much paint on the model at once. So it's important to make sure that you allow the layers to thoroughly dry in between coats. In most cases, if you're using a darker color, you won't have to worry about too much bleed through and the need for a second coat. If you're using a lighter color, like say yellow or something, then you might need to have a second or even third coat. It's also important to make sure that you wash your brushes in between coats. You don't want that paint to dry on the brush, and use that warm water with a few drops of dawn, and as soon as you're done with that section of that group of models, then you can wash your brush and get ready for the next coat when those models are dry. Now, once your models are painted and completely dried, you can decide whether or not you want to add a wash to them. Now, I have 3 different types here: a mid-brown, a soft tone, and a strong tone. And basically it's kind of like a very watery kind of ink. And what that does is it gets into the grooves on the model and makes that detail kind of pop out. Now, the problem is when you add this, this is generically, I call it Nuln oil. That's kind of like the generic type, but these act in the same manner as Nuln oil would. But you want to make sure that you test it out on a small piece of a model before you start washing the entire model in this, because it does change the colors. They tend to get brighter. And another secret is you don't want to use too stiff of a brush when you're putting this on. You want that oil to fill into the crevices of the model. So you want to use a very soft brush. And basically, you don't want to use too much of this oil. You want to just do a very, very little bit on the tips. And then once you've got that on there, you just want to kind of brush that in and let it kind of flow where it will. And that's kind of, and then that will bring out the details of that model. But I would definitely test it in a small corner, probably at the bottom or something, like down here, and you can see before you cover the entire model, see how it looks and whether you want to do that or not. For the most part, if you use a very soft tone, it adds a lot of highlights to the model, but it won't make it look too garish. Now, there is another technique that you can use. We won't be using them on these models, but basically it's dry brushing. And what you're doing is you're putting paint on the brush and you're wiping the majority of it off. And you want to use a very stiff brush. And you're basically wiping the majority of it off. How this would work is, like, say as an example, when I painted some things for Shadows of Brimstone, and I wanted to get the look of a weathered rock. Well, I basically primed them in black. Then I took some gray paint and got it on the tips of the bristles. You wipe off the majority of it, and then you're doing a dry brush technique. And basically what you're doing is you're just doing kind of like this, letting that small amount of paint that you have on the brush kind of work in, and then it produces an effect like a shading. If you're using the big contrast between black and, say, gray, it'll make that surface that you're painting look like a weathered stone. So the secret to that is making sure you don't have too much paint on the brush. You would wipe off 95% of it, and you're just basically using the brush to kind of, what it does is it picks up on the portions of the model that are furthest away, closest to you, and it gives them a highlight of whatever color you're using. So it's kind of a neat technique depending upon, what you're doing. In the case of buildings, we wouldn't need that, but if you were doing, say, a model of a character and you wanted to make them look like they had mud on their boots or something, you can use that dry brush technique, and that works quite well. Another tip for dry brushing is this. The closer that you hold the brush towards the tip, the more paint that is going to go on the model. So if you're dry brushing it, holding it close, you're going to get a lot more coverage that way. The highlights will be greater. If you're holding it farther away, it'll be less and a little lighter. So you can kind of control how much you're putting on by where you're holding that paintbrush. And that's about it for this video. I'm not going to record me painting the models, but I will show you the final results when I've completed the process. So I hope that this painting video was helpful to some of the viewers that are not that experienced like myself in painting. And basically, if you have just a little bit of knowledge, you can feel pretty comfortable in painting your models. My fear before this was always that I'm going to destroy my models. But I just took the approach of less is more. And you can always safely recover if you've applied paint to a model, like especially these are water-based acrylic paints. You can wash the paint off if you're not happy with it, as long as you do it in a somewhat timely fashion. So you can, if you're not happy with what has happened, you can pretty much wash these off and there won't be any consequences to it. So you can feel pretty safe that what you're going to try to do will get you a better result than just the open gray plastic that it would come from the mold. And that's kind of the approach that I take. My models are never going to be in anybody's museum, but I make them at arm's length, basically at that sight distance. If they look good while I'm playing the game, I'm happy. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I look forward to showing you my models once I've completed the process. So in the meantime, this is Keith from the Solo Gamers Club signing off and wishing everyone a pleasant evening. Good night.